We define the blockchain as a chain of blocks, where each block generates a hash value that is calculated based on the hash value of the block that came before. So this begs the question, well, what about the first block in the chain? Where does its data come from if there's no block to precede it? To solve this, blockchains have the concept of the genesis block. The genesis block serves the purpose of being the origin of the blockchain. It's a hard-coded block with dummy values for the timestamp, last hash, and data values. It's a way for the blockchain to get itself started. That way, when somebody actually adds the first new block to the chain, that first block can set its last hash to the hash of the genesis block. So let's create the genesis block in our project. So here we are in the code editor. In the block.js file, we'll add a new function called genesis after the toString function in the block class. Now we'll also give this function an identifier called static. By marking the function with the static identifier, we enable ourselves to call this genesis function without having to make a new instance of the block class. Meaning, as long as we have the block module imported within a file, we'll be able to use this function directly without having to make a new block instance. So we'll be able to do something like block.genesis in other files in order to use this function over here. All right, with this genesis function now, we can create a new instance of this block class and return it. So what we're going to do is return a new instance of this block class. So that's return new this. And then this is a keyword, which will be a representation of the class itself. Now, as for the arguments within this genesis this function, we can create some default values for a genesis block. So the first argument for the constructor is the timestamp, and we don't need to do a real timestamp. We can have a dummy value like genesis time. And then the second argument is a last hash. And again, we're going to have a dummy value since the genesis block doesn't have anything that came before it. And then for the actual hash of it, how about some leet speak data? This means first hash, so F1R57 is leet speak for first, and then dash H45H. So that kind of looks like first hash with just some numbers substituted for characters. And then for the data, we're going to want an empty array as the first data for the genesis block. All right, great. So we've created this static genesis function. Now let's check it out with our dev test file. So go to devtest.js, and then let's add a console.log that directly calls this block.genesis function. So we're going to console.log, and then directly we're going to use block.genesis. And then if we want the string representation of this block, we're going to convert that with the toString function to its string representation. All right, so save that, and you should have that console.log block.genesis toString line. And then we're ready to check it out. So go ahead and go to your command line now. So in the command line, let's run our testing script, npm run dev-test, and you may have it still running in the background from the previous lesson, but if not, go ahead and re-execute the script. And as we do so, we find our first block that we created manually, and then indeed we see our genesis block over here, and you'll notice that the data is empty since it's an empty array, and Node knows not to print anything for empty data, but indeed we see that we have our timestamp, our last hash, and our hash. Sweet. So that completes creating the genesis block. With this genesis block, we have a way to start the blockchain now, with the first default block in the chain. Let's move on to creating new custom blocks with a new MineBlock function that will generate a new block based on the data that we provide for it, as well as another piece of data which will represent the last block.